Hey guys, we are back with another pretty interesting Survivor ranking here, and that is going to be ranking every player that received the most votes against them in their respective season. And this was actually based off an idea that was suggested to me by Cubeboy51, who is a member of my Discord server, so be sure to check that out. And originally the idea suggested was to just look at pre-merge votes, so looking at people who came into the merge with the most amount of votes against them. And while I still may do that video down the road, I figured this particular ranking was interesting, looking at people who got the most votes across their entire season here. So I'll be ranking everyone there. And in general, I find this topic to be pretty interesting, as these are primarily people who were pretty consistent targets over the course of the season, either due to them being on the bottom or them being out in front. And I think for a lot of these players, the fact that they were these pretty big targets also made it pretty difficult for them to gain a lot of agency in the game, or to be able to navigate through the game in as efficient as a way compared to people who win the game or people who dominate the game. So I figured it'd be interesting to compare like these pretty consistent targets side by side and see how they fare in the grand scheme of things. And before we get started, I just want to clarify my criteria for this list. So I'll be looking at people who had the most votes cast against them, as opposed to the most votes counted against them. As while some of these people may have had some of these votes negated by an idle play or some other means, I still wanted to look at votes casted against, as it reflects the fact that they were targeted to begin with, even though they may have had idols to potentially get around that. And on top of that, I wanted to limit this list to one per season. And with that, there were actually a few seasons where there was a tie for who received the most votes cast against. And while I could have included all these people and made this list even longer than what it already is, for the purposes of this list, I decided to go with the person who attended the most amount of tribals to get the amount of votes that they did. As while you could argue that the people who attended less tribals but still got the same amount of votes were probably bigger targets in the grand scheme of things, I feel like the purpose of this list is to capture people who were consistently targeted throughout the game, as opposed to just having a whole bunch of votes piled onto them at one specific tribal here. So with that, let's go through each of the seasons where there is a tie. So first up, we have Survivor Africa, where there is a tie between Clarence and Lindsay, each receiving 12 votes. However, Clarence attended more tribals, so he'll be on this list instead of Lindsay. Next up, we have Survivor Pearl Islands, where Burton and Lil are actually tied here for most votes against, which is funny considering that they were both voted out and came back into the game. However, Lil obviously attended more tribals than Burton, so she'll be on the list instead. Next up, we have Survivor All-Stars, where there's actually a three-way tie between Jerry, Lex, and Alicia at 7 votes each. And while Alicia ended up making it the furthest out of these three, Jerry actually attended the most amount of tribals, so she'll be on the list instead. Next up, we have Survivor Palau, where there was actually a 4-way tie, with Kim, Willard, Angie, and Stephanie all receiving 8 votes against each. However, Stephanie obviously attended the most amount of tribals, so she'll be on the list here. Next up, we have Survivor Guatemala, where there was a tie between Jamie and Lydia. However, Lydia attended the most amount of tribals, so she'll be on the list. Next up, we have Survivor Panama, where Shien and Aris are tied at 9 votes each. However, Aris obviously attended more tribals, so he'll be on the list instead. Next up, we have Survivor Samoa, where there was a tie between Eric Cardona and Laura Moret. However, Laura attended more tribals, so she'll be on the list instead. Next up, for Survivor Heroes vs. Villains, there was a tie between Amanda and Rupert. However, Rupert attended more tribals, so he'll be on the list instead. Next up, we're jumping forward to Survivor Cagayan, where there was a tie here between Jeremiah and Jeffra. Jeffra attended one more tribal, so she will be on the list instead of Jeremiah. Next up for Co-Wrong, we have Alicia and Aubrey being tied with 8 votes against each. However, Aubrey attended more tribals, so she'll be on the list instead. Next up for Survivor 42, there was a tie between Chanel and Lydia at 9 votes each. However, Chanel attended the most amount of tribals, so she will be on the list instead. In the final season so far with a tie is Survivor 43, where there was a tie between Ryan and Janine. However, Ryan attended more tribals, so he'll be on the list instead of Janine. So with all those ties out of the way, we have 48 players to talk about, and I'll be ranking them based on how I feel like they played on the season where they got the most amount of votes. But let's not waste any more time, let's get into the video. So starting off at number 48, the person I believe played the worst game out of this grouping of players is Big Wendy from Survivor Edge of Extinction, who ended up getting 15 votes against her, despite her being a pre-merge boot. where I feel like there was not that much redeeming to Wendy's game with her being a pretty big target right out the bat, and also just losing a lot of her allies early on, where she ends up losing Reem early on, and even being the secondary target during that round. She also ends up losing Keith immediately afterwards, and being one of the only people to not vote him out. That's pretty bad. And she was also part of this plan to target Kelly Wentworth at the Fallen Tribal, but is blindsided there, loses Chris, and she probably would have gone out had they ever gone back to Tribal, but they end up swapping, and while she's the only person to swap over from her tribe, and while she's able to get through the Aubrey round alright, where Aubrey was kind of this obvious target at that point, she's then immediately taken out at the Joint Tribal, with her tribe not even seeming to care that they were letting her go. And it's even more damning considering that the other tribe at that Joint Tribal was literally her old tribe. Like, that other tribe was entirely made up of people that were on her original starting tribe. So the fact that she wasn't even courted as a swing vote when it was a tied situation is even bigger of a knock against her, and just shows how little people seem to care for her in a game. So at the end of the day, I feel like Wendy's someone who it was clearly not a good player and someone who didn't play particularly well across her season. And while it seemed like the swap could have been this turning point for her, it simply wasn't, if we're being really honest. Where while she does survive the Aubrey round, there isn't really much redeeming to her game, which is why she's here at number 48. Now moving on to number 47, and we actually have someone who made it to the merge, which is interesting considering there are actually other pre-merge boots here that we still have to talk about. However, this person did make it to the merge, though not much beyond that. And here we have Clarence from Survivor Africa. I feel like Clarence is his low simply because he was pretty much on the bottom the entire time, where he's clearly on the bottom of the original Barong group, where you obviously have the Beangate situation that really caused him to become this big target from the likes of Tom and Ethan, for example. And while he's able to survive the Diane and Jesse votes, a lot of that came down to him like being an asset in challenges more so than them actually like having a good relationship with him. And then get to the swap, where while he does build a good bond with Silas initially, that could have resulted in him flipping over to Silas's side, that later falls through and Silas is taken out, and he's still on the bottom moving forward. And then we get to the merge where he's just voted out near unanimously in an 8-2 vote, where the only reason it's not unanimous is due to T-Bird throwing a vote into Lex that Lex later thought was Kelly, but really, Clarence didn't really have much of a shot of staying here. I feel like no one really had this connection to him at that point. And with the fact that he largely gets to the game through his physical strength more so than his social bonds, I feel like it would have been very difficult for him to really get past the merge round that he even got there. So I do feel like at the end of the day, Clarence is someone who, while I do like a lot, he was still someone who was on the bottom for pretty much the entire time. And that's a major reason why he's here at number 47. Now moving on to number 46, and we actually have another person who made it to the merge, though their game outside of that is still very mediocre. And here we have John Robert, who ended up getting 12 votes against him on Survivor China. And John Robert is another one who, yes, he does technically make it to the merge. However, he's also another one who was on the bottom for pretty much the entire time and never seemed to fully realize it, where we do see him early on being on the bottom of the original Fei Longs, and while he does vote out Leslie at that first tribal and later votes out Sharia after the swap, I feel like it's in a situation to where Leslie is someone who is clearly an outsider there, and then Sharia was someone who was from the other tribe after the swap. So I feel like it made sense why they would take out them over John Robert. And at the same time, Todd was also playing John Robert, using him as a shield early on, and again, never seeming to pick up on it. And on top of that, was also someone who was pretty hated by a lot of his tribe, where he obviously had a pretty bad relationship with Courtney and Amanda that made it so that he was not really well respected in the game. He was a bit of a donkey. Then get to the merge round where he does vote out Jamie, but is also the secondary target there. And then the very next round, he's just cut due to him not being necessary anymore, where by that point, the Fei Longs had the numbers to steamroll the rest of the game. And with JR not really bringing much unity to the tribe, where obviously Courtney was against him, it made sense why he was cut at that point. So the fact that he's voted out by his own tribe so early in the game when he wasn't even that big of a threat to win really speaks to how much on the bottom he really was. So I do feel like at the end of the day, JR's game is pretty bad despite making it to the merge. The reason I have him above Clarence, however, is that he didn't rely solely on his physical strength. Like, he was at least working with Todd at a point, even though he was like the 5th in that alliance. And again, he also like does survive the merge round at least, voting the majority. So I feel like those things were just enough to have him above Clarence, though not too much higher than number 46. Now moving on to number 45, and we're going back now to the pre-merge, and someone who I thought was going to be below Clarence and Jean Robert, though after thinking about it, I figured they were at least in the majority for a little bit in the game. But number 45, we do have Chet from Survivor Micronesia, who received 15 votes against him. And again, people hate on Chet a lot, and there's obviously some valid reason for that, though I think the thing about Chet is that while he was seen as this big challenge weakness and someone who wasn't really well liked by the likes of Joel, like, he was technically part of the majority alliance on the initial fans tribe, where, yes, while he was targeted by the likes of Mary and Mikey B, he was part of that group with Tracy and Kathy that's able to flip over Joel to flip the game against Mary and Mikey B, which is all pretty good. Mind you, I feel like Chet does almost nothing to enact that, where he is still disliked by Joel even after Joel flips against Mary, but I feel like it's through his connection with Tracy that really allows him to get through a lot of that early game. And that even carries over to the swap, where he and Tracy are part of this plan to potentially blindside Ozzy, though it's obviously ruined by Chet quitting the game. And obviously, while it's brought on by his injury that made it even less likely he'll do well in challenges than what he was already bringing, I still think that's at least something to consider here. But I feel like at the end of the day, Chet is someone who is still a pre-merge boot, and is still someone who very much was targeting the game, and still someone who I don't think is that good of a player in the grand scheme of things. But again, it's the fact that he was at least part of the majority group on the initial fans tribe that was enough to have him at least a few spots higher to where he's here at number 45. Now moving on to number 44, and we are going back to another player who made it to the merge, though not much beyond that. By number 44, we do have Adam Klein, and this is obviously his game from Winners at War. And I feel like Adam is someone who was pretty much on the bottom the entire time, where while he does vote correctly at each of the tribals he attends up until his boot, I feel like he was pretty clearly on the bottom for most of his run, and someone who kind of gets fortunate by the fact that there were bigger targets to him that allowed him to skate through a lot of the early rounds, where right off the bat, he's on the bottom of the original Cele and kind of gets spared by Natalie and Jeremy being this clear duo that they felt they need to break up. And while he's able to recover a bit, where he builds a good enough bond with Denise to where Denise gives him the half idol, and he's pretty safe during the Danny round, he then makes himself a target again during the following round, where he tells Boss and Rob that he intended to target Parvati, which causes him to be a target by that side of things, so is able to scrape through that by targeting Ethan. We get to the swap, where he's very lucky by the fact that Boss and Rob is a clear target for his side of things, and while he's able to vote out Boss and Rob, he is clear on the bottom of the Yara tribe, would have been voted out had they ever gone back to tribal. And coming to the merge, he's seen as his pretty easy target, where during the Wendell round, he's the secondary target there, and then he's just immediately taken out next. So I do feel like Adam's someone who really got through the game by the skin of his teeth, barely surviving a lot of these rounds. And while there is some good play here and there by his relationship with Denise, and also him at least thinking that there could have been an idol at tribal, he was still at the bottom the entire time. Kind of gets fortunate by the fact that there were bigger targets to take out over him, and just barely scraped his way to the merge, only to be on the bottom the whole time. So for that reason, I couldn't really have him too much higher here than number 44. Now moving on to number 43, and we're going back now to an earlier boot, and that is Sarah Jones from Survivor Marquesas, who got 11 votes against her. And I kind of struggled what to do with Sarah, as I feel like considering how early of a boot she was, I feel like her game wasn't entirely bad, where she did seem to be part of the majority on the original Maramu tribe, where she obviously had a bit of a fling with Boss and Ra, but beyond that was able to be part of Boss and Rod's alliance, where she was part of the plan to flip the game against Hunter and Patricia during those early rounds, even voting the majority to take up Peter Harkey, even though that was technically a number for her side. But she was still part of the initial majority group, and was kind of unlucky by the fact that her tribe just kept losing challenges, and her being targeted due to her being kind of seen as a weakness there. And she ends up getting taken out after the swap due to her being down numbers due to it being a swap. So I do feel like even her boot was a bit unlucky with the fact that her tribe was down numbers. Even the way that the tribe swap broke down made it so that she was always going to be down numbers anyway. So I actually think Sarah has some merits to her game that makes me want to put her a little bit higher, but at the end of the day, she's still only the 4th boot of the season. And on top of that, I feel like she didn't really have that much agency in what the Alliance did, where I always felt like Boss and Rob had a lot more control in how that Alliance operated during those early days. So I couldn't really put her too high on this list, but I still think there's some merit to her game, which is why she's here at number 43. Now moving on to number 42, and we're going back now to a post-merger, though someone who was largely on the bottom during a lot of the season. But number 42, we do have Sierra from Survivor Tokensheens, who ended up getting 11 votes against her. And I think there are definitely similarities to Adam Klein from Winners of War, in the sense that Sierra is someone who was largely on the bottom during a lot of the season, where while she did have some allies along the way, I feel like she had very little agency in how the game was playing out. Where early on, she is towards the bottom of the pecking order on the original Tambira group, where, well, you could say that she got unlucky in the sense that she got sick early on, and that results in her being voted out of her tribe, and a lot of people not really trusting her fully. I still think a lot of it was also due to people like Coach not really liking her that much. Though with that said, there are other targets on the board like Candace and Jerry that allows her to get through those early rounds. Not to mention she was able to build a pretty good bond with Brendan as well, to where she at least had one ally on board. And through their connection with the likes of Steven and Taj and this Exile Alliance that Brendan was forming, there's definitely a shot that they could have been part of the majority moving forward. Though with that said, I think there are some problems here. One in the sense that Brendan was clearly more the alpha in putting that alliance together, to where I feel like Sierra wasn't as involved in putting that alliance together. But on top of that, neither of them were able to really manage those relationships well, to where coming to the merge, despite them having these connections to Steven and Taj, we see Steven and Taj instead decide to work with Coach and Debbie, which I feel like is a pretty bad sign there. To where at that first round after the merge, they decide to split the vote on Brendan and Sierra there. That results in her losing Brendan, her closest ally. And then she's a secondary target the following round, where while they do ultimately flip the vote onto Tyson, that was more so due to Tyson being this big physical threat, more so than them wanting to keep Sierra around. And then she's just taken out the following round, the final 7. So I do feel like Sierra's game for the most part is pretty mediocre, where while she does get all the way to the final 7, and there are at least some minor pros, like her relationship with Brendan and her at least voting in the majority for most of the votes that she attended, I still feel like Sierra is someone who was on the bottom for most of her run. I can't really imagine her winning the game had she gotten to the end either. So really, I feel like Sierra's game is pretty bad, to where she's here at number 42. Now moving on to number 41, and we're moving on to yet another early merge boot, but someone who I think has some serious holes in their game. But number 41, we do have Chanel from Survivor 42. And you could definitely argue that Chanel should be at least a few spots higher here, though after thinking about it, I feel like Chanel's game is pretty mediocre and one that doesn't really have much merit to it. Now, to her credit, she is part of the initial majority group on the Vati tribe, where she has a good connection with Daniel, and through her relationships with Mike and Jenny, that should have put her in a pretty good spot coming to that first tribal. However, she does make a pretty critical error during the journey she goes on in episode 3, where she ends up risking her vote for some reason, despite her being about to go to tribal. And with Omer also risking his vote, it made it so that she couldn't vote there. And while that's not the only thing that resulted in that trial going wrong for her, I still think it was an unforced error and one that could have easily been prevented. But through her risking her vote, it really enabled that vote to go south, where it resulted in a tie happening and the vote being deadlocked, and obviously Daniel ends up ceding ground too high there. That results in Jenny being taken out, who was one of Chanel's allies there. And all this really results in her being on the bottom from that point forward, where while Daniel's the bigger pariah in the tribe and he gets taken out there, it's still in a spot to where Chanel was the secondary target at that tribal, and coming to the merge, she's outside the majority group and kind of gets saved by the fact that she was part of the winning team for that challenge, and it's just a consensus target at the following round, where, well, I could say she got unlucky by having voted for Mike during the Daniel tribal and Mike taking that personally. She probably would have been voted out anyway, considering she was pretty alone in the game at that point and was a pretty easy target by the majority to take out. So at the end of the day, I feel like Chanel is someone who, just by making it to the merge, I feel like her game is one where she is on the bottom for more points where she's on top. And I feel like a lot of the reason why she got put on the bottom was due to her making this mistake during the journey that she went on in episode 3. So at the end of the day, while I like Chanel, and I think she's probably a better player than what her placement here demonstrates, I feel like her game on this season is pretty mediocre, to where she's here at number 41. Now moving on to number 40, and we're moving on now to a string of players that made very deep runs on their seasons, but ones where they were pretty aloof and pretty much on the bottom for most, if not all of it. But number 40, we're starting off this group with Eddie Fox from Survivor Karamoan, who actually gets all the way to the final 4, which is pretty crazy considering his place on this list. But if we look at his path and how he got there, it is really bad, where he is on the bottom for pretty much the entire season. where right away on the fans group, he is part of the initial Cool Kids Alliance that ends up being the minority and ends up losing Ally and Hope pretty quickly, with him even being a secondary target during the Hope Tribal, but was able to survive that. After the swap, he's still not a great spot, but they never go to Tribal, so that's whatever. And then after the merge, he is once again down numbers, where he does at least have Reynold and Malcolm by his side and the three Migos, but they end up losing Corinne and Michael Snow pretty quickly. And while they get a 1-up on the majority of the following round by idling out Philip, it's also in a spot to where Eddie was also being targeted and he needed an idol, otherwise he would have been voted out there. But then immediately afterwards, they lose Malcolm and Reynold back to back, and at that point, the majority alliance turns on each other, where they vote out Andrew at the final 7, Brent at the final 6, and then Eddie's just on the bottom the entire time, where he doesn't even vote out Brenda or Andrea. He's just on the outs there and is even a secondary target at the Brenda Tribal. And then he's eventually just taken out at the final 4 unceremoniously. So it's a pretty bad game where he's on the bottom for almost the entire time. He gets 16 votes against him, which is definitely a lot. And I feel like there's just very little to praise with Eddie's game outside the fact that he got to the final 4. But really, I feel like Eddie's game is pretty bad to where he's here at number 40. Now moving on to number 39, and we have yet another person who made it somewhat deep into the game. However, their path there is not the greatest in the world. But number 39, we do have Ryan from Survivor 43, who ends the season with 9 votes against him. And I've already talked about Ryan plenty of times before. I feel like his game is pretty rough considering his placement. Though I do think there are at least some merits to him, in terms of this list at least, where he was at least part of the majority during the early merge section, and also got a bit unlucky by his boot round in the sense that he would have been saved had James not been voted out of the other split tribals, so I do have to give him at least that. Though I think his game outside of that is still pretty bad, where he's on the bottom for pretty much the entire pre-merge, where while he does have Gio by his side and kind of has a relationship with Carla, Carla was always siding with the other group, the James, Cassidy, and Lindsay side of things, and kind of gets lucked out in the first tribal by Lindsay having her freak out that results in Lindsay being the target over Gio. And then the following round, he even throws a challenge thinking that he has the numbers blindside Cassidy, only for him to lose Gio instead. So I do feel like Ryan had a pretty bad misread on his position on the tribe. Really only gets saved by the fact that he was his physically stronger person compared to Gio there. So I do feel like his pre-merge is pretty bad. And while he does vote in the majority for those first 3 rounds, voting out Ellie, Dwight, and Janine, it's also the spot to where he's voting along tribal lines more so than him actually having that great a relationship with the rest of the players in the game. And while he does get unlucky in the boot round, where he would have been saved over Cassidy had Owen been voted out instead, I don't think he would have lasted too much longer beyond that, where I never got the sense that he was positioned well to get towards the end of the game. And even if he somehow did, I don't think he would have had the respect to win a jury vote. So I do think Ryan is someone who plays a pretty bad game, and while he does get all the way to the final 9 and had the potential to make it a little bit further beyond that, I don't think his game is particularly good. I don't think he was in a position to really win the game if he gotten further in the game. So it's for that reason that I do have him here at number 39. Now moving on to number 38, and we have yet another person who made it very deep into the season, and I actually did consider having this person higher, even though this person is not a good player. Though at the end of the day, I feel like they fit more in with this grouping than the next grouping. By number 38, we do have Tarzan from Survivor One World. And the reason I considered putting Tarzan higher is that he was technically part of the majority for a decent amount of his run, where he was part of Colton's alliance during the pre-merge that really drove a lot of the action on the men's tribe. Even after the swap, he voted out Monica. And then after the merge, he was at least able to work with the woman to where he was the last man standing by the end of it. And there was technically a chance that he could have gotten to the final 3 with Alicia and Christina. So I think when you look at Tarzan's game on paper, I think there's definitely some merits to it, and you can definitely argue that he should be higher on this list. However, even with those merits, I still think Tarzan had very little agency within the game, where even during the pre-merge, while he was part of Colton's alliance, I feel like Colton and Jonas were driving more of the action there. After the swap, he is the secondary target during the Monica tribal. We get to the merge where Jonas does end up going out, and Tarzan being a major reason for that, where obviously Jonas and Tarzan have their feud that results in Jonas being taken out, which is probably not great for Tarzan's game. And yes, while the men were going to be down in numbers anyway, I still think Tarzan didn't do himself any favors there, as it would have made it very difficult for him to get Jonas's vote even if he gotten to the end. But then he's on the outs during the Michael Jefferson vote where he votes for Christina there. He's also on the outs during the Troyzan vote, voting for Christina yet again. And while there was a possibility that he could have gone to the final three with Alicia and Christina, he's not really able to secure that, where Christina was more so willing to allow Kim to get deeper into the game, and he is eventually taken out at the final six. And on top of that, even if he gotten that final three, he doesn't win anyway, where Alicia would have won that instead. So I still think Tarzan is someone who, while he does get all the way to the final six, and he is someone who at least was able to work with the women more so than the other men, is still in a spot to where he was on the bottom of the women's power structure. He would have been cut along the way anyway, and he also doesn't win if he gets to the end. So I feel like it's for those reasons that even though he does make it very deep into the game, I can't really have many higher than number 38. Now moving on to number 37, and we are wrapping up the pre-merge boots here, talking about the final three people on this list who were voted out in the pre-merge. And we also have the first of several people who will actually appear in this list multiple times, which is pretty funny. But at number 37, we have Jerry Manthey, and this is her game from Survivor All-Stars. And Jerry is someone who I feel like played a pretty alright game considering her placement on the season, and is still someone who you can argue got unlucky in her boot round considering how a lot of that broke down. But I feel like Jerry was pretty well situated on a tribe early on, where early on she was part of the majority there, taking out Tina and Rudy back to back. And then even after her tribe gets dissolved and she joins Mogo Mogo, she's still able to get through the next couple of rounds where she votes out Richard Hatch next. She then is a pretty key swing vote during the Colby tribal where she's able to get a one-up on him there. And she's even able to survive over Ethan at the Falling tribal, her fellow Saboga member. Now, there's definitely some wonkiness with that in the sense that Ethan was a former winner and had a target on his back. Also, the fact that Lex went back on his word essentially, which is another piece of wonkiness there. But Jerry is able to get through that. And yes, while she was a secondary target during both the Colby and Ethan tribal, she was able to get through that and was essentially one round away from making it to the merge, only for that last round to be a tribe swap where Amber was the sole person to come over to their tribe. And while Jerry does get unlucky by the fact that Boston Rob had this pregame relationship with Lex and Rob had told Lex to keep Amber safe, I still feel like the fact that the vote lands on Jerry is a bit questionable, where while I could say that Jerry got unlucky by Amber being connected to Rob and Rob being connected to Lex, and that causes Lex and Kathy to flip on the Jerry, I still think Jerry had some outs here where she could have worked with Amber herself, considering that they had played together on a previous season, but also there was Shien, who was someone who was not in the majority at that point, and I feel like Jerry could have tried to flip the vote into Shien, but doesn't. So at the end of the day, I feel like Jerry still had a few outs here, though really it's kind of hard to really assess that aspect to it. But I still think Jerry's game, for the most part, is fine for this list. But considering that she is still a pre-merge boot and was still a target in multiple opportunities, I couldn't really have her any higher than number 37. Now moving on to number 36, and we have yet another pre-merge boot to get into, and someone who I actually mentioned not too long ago. And here we have Shien from Survivor Thailand, who got 10 votes against her. And Shien's another person who is technically a pre-merge boot, but also gets booted in a pretty wonky situation where she had gone to the final 10, which on the last few seasons of the show had been the merge. And they spent a lot of that round thinking that was the merge, only for it to turn out to be a fake merge. And she ends up being taken out due to that, considering that she was openly campaigning against her old tribe and was planning to flip to the Chewy side of things. So she obviously gets pretty unlucky by that aspect to it. Though at the same time, she was already towards the bottom of the Sukjai power structure and probably would have been voted out anyway, even if she hadn't done that and it just been a normal pre-merge round. Though I think if we're looking at Shien's game beyond that, I mean, she was technically voting the majority during a lot of those rounds where she votes out Jed, votes out Stephanie, votes out Rob with 2 Bs, but was always a secondary target out of all those tribals where she ends up getting votes at every single tribal she attends up until the fake merge. But still, like, she had technically gone to the point of the season that was assumed to be the merge. And I feel like had that actually been the merge for the season, then Shien probably would have been able to get a couple rounds deeper into the game where she would have been able to be the last remaining Sukja in the season, which is definitely better than what she ended up getting. And while she probably would have been cut at Final 6 after all the other Sukjais were gone, I feel like the fact that she got sniped out in this fake merge situation is a bit unlucky on her end, and the fact that she is a pre-merge boot is pretty wonky onto itself. So I feel like it's for those reasons that I'm willing to give Shien a little bit of grace here, though at the end of the day, she was still already on the bottom of the Sukjai power structure. She probably would have been voted out anyway, even if the fake merge hadn't happened. But it's largely the fact that she should have gotten a couple rounds deeper into the game had it been a more traditional season that leaves her a few spots higher for me, to where she's here at number 36. Now moving on to number 35, and we have the highest ranked pre-merge boo left on the board to talk about, and here we have Anthony from Survivor Fiji. And I actually really like Anthony. I feel like he's someone who's probably a better player than what his run here demonstrates. I think he's someone who obviously got treated very poorly on the season by the likes of Rocky, for instance. And I think he also got a really bad draw on this season. And I think all those things compound to make me want to put Anthony higher. Though at the same time, he is still a pre-merge boot and someone who got 10 votes against him despite that. Or early on, before the Triads came together, Anthony was able to be part of the Builders Alliance, where it wasn't shown on the show, but before the cast was divided to Triads, the cast was divided essentially in half between the Builders and Explorers Alliance, with Anthony being part of the Builders Alliance. But he was also part of a Black Alliance that came together with the other Black players on the season. And I feel like all those things allowed Anthony to have at least some allies early on. Now, once the Ravu tribe came together, he's obviously in a pretty rough spot where obviously that tribe ends up with no supplies. And at the same time, he is technically in the minority due to the Explorers having the initial majority, though they are able to get around that by taking out Jessica and Erica, those first two tribals. But it's not too long before Anthony starts to become a target in the game due to him being seen as like this weakness for his tribe. He ends up getting votes against him at both the Sylvia and Rita tribals, though he's able to remain safe there. However, he then gets a really bad tride swap where he not only remains on the Ravu beach that still has no supplies and has a massive disadvantage, but he's also separated from all of his allies, where the likes of Earl and Yowman all go over to the Moto camp, while at the same time he's left with Mookie, Rocky, both of whom were against him at that point, and then you add in Alex and Gardo, people who were part of the Explorers Alliance and were working more so with Mookie and Rocky. And Anthony was pretty much screwed at this point, where he was pretty much the next target on the board. And with him being very unlikely to win the next few challenges, considering he was still on the Rabu beach, it makes sense why he gets taken out there. So I do feel like Anthony gets very much screwed over by how the season plays out, not only with him being on the Ravu camp, but also just how this tride swap played out. However, I still think considering the circumstances he was given, I think Anthony played well enough to where he is the highest ranked of the pre-mergers. But at the end of the day, he's still a pre-merge boot too, where I couldn't exactly put him too much higher, but it was enough to have him here at number 35. Now moving on to number 34, and from this point on, every single person left on this list made it to at least the merge, though this next one is a bit questionable. But at number 34, we do have Laura Moret. And this is her game from Blood vs. Water. However, we will also be ranking her Samoa game, which qualifies for this list, but we'll get to that soon enough. And Laura's game here is pretty bad, where she's pretty much on the bottom right from the offset, where she's actually the secondary target during the day one vote, where it was between her and Candace getting votes there, which is pretty bad. But even moving forward, she's clearly on the bottom of the returnee try, to where while they do win those first few immunities, she then voted out at the first opportunity, being voted out unanimously at the first tribal they go to. And this is despite Laura B being there as his other easy target. They just had to go for Laura Moret instead. And then she does spend the next few rounds at Redemption Island before winning her way back into the game at the merge. And then after she comes back, she does work with Tyson's Alliance for the first few rounds after the merge, where she does vote out Aris, Vitas, and Tina. But even then, she's still on the bottom of that alliance, where she doesn't really have much of a path forward. And then we literally see at the final 8, they literally just turn on her, voting her out in a 7-1 vote, with even Sierra voting her out, which is a pretty iconic moment there. But it's still a pretty rough run for Laura here, where despite her not even being that big of a threat, she still ends up getting taken out in this position here 2 times across the season. So I do feel like Laura's game here is pretty rough here, and there's definitely an argument for her being even lower on the list, but I still think Laura's probably a better player in the grand scheme of things than the post-merge people we already talked about. So I figured that was just enough to leave her at least above like this very bottom tier, though not much higher than number 34. Now moving on to number 33, and we have another person who, despite making it to the merge and having at least one move on their resume, I feel like their game outside of that is pretty rocky. But number 33, we do have Jen Brown from Survivor Worlds Apart. And Jen is another person who, despite making it to the merge and despite her being the majority for at least part of the game, I feel like her game itself is not particularly great. And she was obviously in a good amount of danger, where early on, while she was technically part of the majority on the no collar tribe. She becomes a target during the first tribal they attend. And there was actually a very serious plan in place to take her out, where you had Vince, Will, and Nina all conspiring to take her out in a 3-2-1 vote, only for Will to essentially screw up that plan and take out Vince instead, which is pretty funny. But I feel like Jen herself survives by the skin of her teeth. And while she is able to get through the Nina round all right, and even after the swap, she remains pretty safe there. We then get to the merge, where at that point the no callers are down in numbers, and Jen is the primary target at that tribal to where she needs an idol to save herself. That's not particularly great. And then even afterwards, they're still down numbers to where the no callers start to be picked off, with Haley going out at the final 11, Joe goes at the final 10. And by that point, Jen essentially stops playing the game to where she essentially wants to give up, doesn't really care about it anymore, and she is eventually taken out at the final 9. So I do feel like Jen's game is one where, while she does like pull off the idol play, it's also in a spot to where she would have been taken out had she not played that idol. And even on that, the fact that she just kind of gives up at the end, and even before that was a target at the first tribal, I feel like all those things are not particularly great. But I feel like it was still enough to leave her above like the very bottom tier for me, to where she's here at number 33. Now moving on to number 32, where we're going back now to someone who made it a bit deeper into the game, though I feel like they didn't have the most agency in the world. But number 32, we do have Karishma from Survivor Islands of the Idols. And Karishma is someone who was definitely hard to assess, in the sense that I feel like she's probably a better player than what she demonstrated on the season. But at the end of the day, I feel like she's still someone who didn't have the most capital in the world and was a pretty consistent target during the season, to where she ends the season with 22 votes against her, which is currently the record for most votes against in a single season, which was definitely a consideration over where to put her here. Though if we were looking at her game beyond that, there are definitely some points where she was alright. Early on, she seems to be safe enough on the Lyro tribe to where she's pretty safe during the Ronnie vote. Though by the second tribal, she's already starting to be talked about as a target, where she ends up getting votes against her during the Vince and Chelsea votes, and even after the swap also gets votes against her during the Tom Laylaw tribal. And on top of that, she starts to be left out of key alliances that, while she does end up voting the majority during a lot of these tribals, she's not really being included in a lot of alliances. That really does put her in a bad spot later on in the game. And that carries over to the merge as well, to where she ends up voting for Dan during the Kelly tribal. During the Jamal tribal, she's a secondary target. During the split tribal, she does vote out Missy, but also misses the opportunity to take out Tommy there. And she's a pretty big target at the final 9, to where she has to play an idol to save herself, which already isn't great, but even then was unable to get out her target in Janet, which in itself was a pretty misguided play, as why didn't she just go for Tommy instead? But I feel like Karishma doesn't really get her way in that round, even with her being a target. And then at the final 8, while she was part of this plan to flip the game on Tommy as the GOAT army that planned to falling apart at tribal, and obviously there was a lot of shifting around that tribal, as like Tommy found out about the plan and Nora leaked that Elaine had an idol. A lot of stuff happened that eventually results in the vote landing on her. So I do feel like she gets a bit unlucky in that spot, that with all this chaos, the vote just lands on her. It's this pretty safe vote, but I feel like the fact that Karishma was already on the bottom for a decent amount of the post-merge is not particularly great, and that's a big reason why she isn't higher on the list. Though at the same time, I still think the fact that she was at least part of the majority early on, and even then, like, had some tribals that went her way, it was enough to where I couldn't have her too low, but at the end of the day, I feel like her game was pretty bad, to where she's here at number 32. Now moving on to number 31, and we have another person who was on the bottom for a decent amount of their run, despite making it pretty far into the game. Though with that said, I feel like this person had a bit more agency compared to Karishma, and definitely had more opportunities to get into a better position. But at number 31, we do have Michael Yerger from Survivor Ghost Island. And Michael is someone who spends a lot of the season as an underdog, where while he's in a fine enough position on the original Malolo tribe, he is quickly put on the bottom after the swap where the Navides had the numbers, and with there not being any cracks, he's just simply sitting duck for the next few rounds, where he loses Brendan, loses Stephanie. Though with that said, he at least tries to better situation, where during the Brennan round, he does try to trick the other side into thinking that his idol could be played on 2 people, sort of taking advantage of the fact that it was James's idol from Survivor China, though it's ultimately unsuccessful by the end of it. And then he also gets a pretty bad second swap where he's once again down numbers and is forced to put out James in the next tribal, and he probably would have gone home had they gone back to tribal, but they don't. And then from the merge on, he is once again in a pretty bad spot where Again, the Navides had the numbers, Don Wendell dominated the game, and there's not really much Michael can do about it. And he's a pretty big target by Dom and Wendell for the next few rounds, where during the Libby round, he was the primary target and has to save himself with an idol. During the Desiree round, he was once again considered a target, though kind of gets fortunate by Desiree sticking her neck out there. And he's eventually taken out during the split tribal. Though with that said, he actually did have an out there where there was definitely a shot that Kellen could have used her extra vote to potentially cause a flip against Laurel, though that doesn't ultimately go through by the end of it. So all in all, it's actually a pretty rough game for Michael, where he spent so much of the game on the bottom, barely surviving and just losing a lot of his allies. And there's definitely an argument for him being lower. Though with that said, I feel like Michael was at least trying to better his situation. He was at least trying to flip the game on multiple opportunities. And I feel like had he survived his particular round, there's a shot that he could have caused a flip the following round, where we literally see in the following round that Chelsea tried to cause a flip there, though that was unsuccessful. But I feel like Michael's someone who definitely had more of a path forward and definitely has more potential as a player compared to other people who were in a similar spot to him and spent a lot of game on the bottom. But at the end of the day, it's the fact that he was an underdog for so much of the season that leaves him behind here at number 31. Now moving on to number 30, and we have another person who I kind of struggle with where exactly to put them. But at number 30, we're actually going to the original season of the show, and here we have Jenna Lewis, who ends up getting 11 votes against her on this season. And obviously the tough thing with Borneo is just the fact that there wasn't that high of gameplay going on, especially from Jenna's tribe for a lot of the season. Though with that said, I still think there's some questionable moves to be made here, where the fact that she votes at Ramona at the second tribal, when Ramona was pretty close to her, is pretty questionable. And while she is voting in the majority for a lot of the pre-merge, she's not really in that great of a power position, where I feel like the likes of Gretchen and Colleen are probably in better spots compared to Jenna in particular. Though with that said, she eventually gets an emerge tied in numbers, where at that point the Pagongs are just completely scatterbrained and not really like working as an alliance. And that really causes the Pagongs to be Pagonged, where she ends up voting for Jervis during the Gretchen tribal. She then votes out Greg in a spot to where she was a secondary target of that tribal. And then we get to her boot round, where she does at least try to flip the game against Richard by pulling in the remaining Pagongs. And with Kelly being someone who was starting to defect from that alliance, there was definitely a shot that they could have pulled them in, but Kelly just votes for Shien, which is pretty silly there, and Jenna just gets taken out there. So I feel like Jenna's game is pretty hard to assess, where while she does at least try to flip the game at the very end of her run, I feel like it's a bit too late, and at that point she was already in a pretty rough spot, not to mention the fact that even the Pagongs had gotten the numbers and gotten to the end with them. I don't think Jenna's a particularly likely winner there either, as it didn't seem like she was the most well-respected member of the Pagong, so it's kind of hard to have Jenna too much higher beyond this, but it's the fact that she at least tried to flip the game at the very end that leaves her a little bit higher for me, which is why she's here at number 30. Now moving on to number 29, and we're going back now to some early merge boots who were pretty big players during the pre-merge and had agency at points, though either lost that agency after the merge or didn't have the most consistent grasp on the game. By number 29, we're starting it off with Marty Piombo from Survivor Nicaragua, who got 15 votes against him during his season. And Marty, I think, fits in pretty well with this year, where Marty was a pretty big player on the original Espada tribe, where he had a pretty close ally in Jill and Dan Lembo, and was a pretty big factor during those early votes, taking out Wendy Joe, Jimmy Johnson, and Jimmy T, though he does lose control after the swap, where he is down in numbers, and was a pretty big target during that first tribal, though it ends up being a tie, and they take out Kelly Bruno in the revote. And while we see him trying to build some inroads with the LaFleur members by giving Sash his idol and telling Fabio he's a just Grandmaster, he's still in a pretty rough spot afterwards, especially with the likes of Jane actively gunning for him, and he ends up losing Jill at the next tribal they go to. And then after the merge, he is a pretty big target while having very little agency in the game, where he doesn't really have anyone left willing to work with him. And while he gets through the Alina round all right, he is the pretty clear target at the next tribal where he gets taken out there. So I feel like Marty is someone who fits in pretty well with this grouping of people who were definitely trying to play a big game, but just didn't really have the most amount of agency in the world and really was a dead man walking by the time of the merge. But it's the fact that he at least had some control early on that leaves him a little bit higher for me, which is why he's here at number 29. Now moving on to number 28, and we have another player who was a pretty big factor in the pre-merge, but lost control after the merge. And we actually have the person for the most recent season on the board. And here we have Say from Survivor 48, who ended up getting 15 votes against her during her run. And obviously Say was a pretty big player during the pre-merge, though with that said, I don't feel like she was in as much control as what the show made it seem like, where while she is responsible for creating the initial majority on the Vula tribe, I feel like the likes of Justin and Cedric were in better positions compared to her, and I feel like with Say being more out in front, it really led to her being the bigger target during a lot of those early tribals. Though, with that said, she's able to take out Stephanie and Kevin without too much difficulty, though they end up running into a roadblock at the next tribal where they had this plan to target Mary, only for Mary to use her shot in the dark, and that really caused them to go to a revote. And she was in a lot of danger at that point, where there's definitely a shot that she could have gone home, especially if Justin was able to keep his vote and kind of gets lucked out by that. Though with that said, I do think Say does a well enough job at campaigning to stay by really appealing to Cedric and convincing him to flip his vote onto Justin when he had already voted for Say before. So I do have to give her a bit of credit for that. Though I think her game afterwards is a bit more turbulent, where she does end up swapping afterwards and is kind of in a rough spot on her new tribe, though is able to get through the Bianca round alright. But then after the merge, she's essentially a dead woman walking, where at that point she's a pretty big target without really having any allies by her side, or she ends up being the secondary target during the charity round, and then she's a pretty consensus target at the split tribal, with it not seeming like she had any path of surviving that round. So I do feel like Say is someone who, despite having a lot of agency early on, I feel like at the point where she was separated from her initial group, she didn't really have any power left in the game, and I feel like it was just a matter of time before she was going to be taken out. So it's for that reason that I couldn't really have Say too much higher, and I feel like she fits in quite a bit with this grouping of players. Though it's the fact that she at least had at least one more impressive move than Marty and saving herself during the Justin tribal that leaves her one spot higher at number 28. Now moving on to number 27, and we have another player who I think fits in well with this group, and another New Era player. By number 27, we do have Caleb from Survivor 45. And to me, Caleb is someone who definitely was in a good spot early on, the original Lulu group. And despite him going to tribal after tribal early on, I feel like Caleb was in an alright spot for those first few tribals, voting out Hannah Rose and Brandon back to back. Though it's around the third tribal that he runs into some danger, where Sabaya, one of his allies, did want to flip the game onto him and was putting together this plan to blindside him. Though with that said, he had built a good enough relationship with Emily to turn the tables on Sabaya instead. Though he does also get kind of lucky that Sabaya doesn't play her idol in that spot when she had it right there. So again, that's something to consider. Though I think after the swap, he was in an interesting spot where we did see him building up on with Jake, and had they gone the tribal, it would have been interesting to see how he navigated that situation. Though similar to Say and Marty, he becomes a pretty massive target after the merge, where he is instantly clocked as this pretty massive target to the point where he's voted out near unanimously, except he ends up using a shot in the dark, ends up staying through that. Though he's just voted out again the following round, where the only difference there is that he at least gets to be on the jury. So it is kind of a weird spot where I do feel like Caleb is someone who I do think fits in with this group, where he is someone who was in a good spot early on, but then after the merge, it's just immediately seen as this massive target and leads to him getting a whole bunch of votes against him. Though I think something else to point out with Caleb is that he did at least have a path to stay during his actual boot round, where he did at least have Jake working by his side, and there was his attempt to flip against Julie, though it was pretty unlikely to go through. So I do feel like those things definitely factored into Caleb being a bit above the likes of Say and Marty. Though it's the fact that he's just immediately targeted after the merge, and the fact that he needed to save himself with the shot in the dark, that makes it very hard for me to have him too much higher than number 27. Now moving on to number 26, and we have yet another person who had control early on, but lost it by the time they went out. By number 26, we do have Roger from Survivor the Amazon, and Roger also very much fits into this tier, where he is someone who clearly was in control of the original men's tribe and really controlled those first two votes, taking out Ryan Aiken and Dan Liu. And even after the swap, he's part of the majority to take out Gene at the one tribal they go to. But similar to the last few people we talked about, he does lose control after the merge, where while he still has the likes of Dave and Butch by his side, everyone else flips on him and he is the clear target there at the merge. And a lot of that coming down to a lot of the women being outright against him due to him being kind of misogynistic, and with him not being likely to vote for a woman at the end if he were on the jury, it made it so that they wanted to vote him out before the jury. And the fact that everyone else flits on him and gets voted out in 17th vote, obviously those things are not particularly great, is a big reason why he is obviously in this grouping of players. But again, he still had control for those first few rounds on the men's tribe. He was clearly the leader of the men's tribe early on. and he ultimately does get outplayed after the merge, which is a big reason why I do have him here at number 26. Now moving on to number 25, and I really struggle with where to put this next person as they don't really fit in with the previous grouping of players. Though with that said, I still think there are at least some impressive elements to their game. By number 25, we do have Rory from Survivor Vanuatu. And I wasn't entirely sure where to put Rory here, as I think there's definitely an argument for him being lower on this list, sort of closer to like where I had some of the people like Kroma and Jen Brown, for instance. Though I still think Rory is someone who was in the majority for more of his run, and someone who still had at least some merits to his game, though he doesn't have the same amount of outright control as the last two people, where he is part of the majority early on in the original men's tribe. He's part of the Fat Five Alliance, and he is a pretty clear target by the minority, to where he's targeted at most of the tribals they attend after that first round, though with him having the Fat Five by his side, that's allowing him to remain pretty safe there. So there's that to consider. Though with that said, I don't think he was really driving a lot of the decisions there, and it's pretty clear that he was kind of towards the bottom of the Fat Five anyway, where the likes of Sarge didn't have the greatest relationship with him, but he's able to remain part of that alliance up until the swap, where he is put down in numbers alongside Bubba, and he is barely surviving those next few rounds, where he kind of gets benefited by Bubba blowing up his game at the immunity challenge that results in Bubba being taken out first. Though with that said, he is able to survive the Lisa tribal, which I do have to find at least somewhat impressive. Though with that said, he also threatened to blow up his game until he won that reward challenge, which I did find something amusing there. Though with that said, he does get to the merge where he is down in numbers and is taken out because of that. Though with that said, I feel like he had more of a backing compared to the last two people we talked about, where he did at least have the other men voting by his side, to where it was only a 6-4 vote. And that was part of the reason why I decided to go with Rory over the likes of Roger, for instance. As I feel like Rory is someone who, had he come into the merge with the numbers, he probably would have been able to last a bit longer in the game. Though with that said, I still think he probably is an unlikely winner, as I feel like the likes of Chris was way better positioned within the Fat Five by that point. But I still think Rory has some merits to his game, like the fact that he was part of the majority early on, and even at the points where he was at the bottom, the fact that he was able to survive 2 tribals on the bottom was enough to have him above this previous group, and a big reason why he's here at number 25. Now moving on to number 24, we have someone who made it a little bit deeper into the game past the early merge phase, but still someone who was booted a bit earlier than what they probably should have, which is definitely a knock against them. And here we have Jerry Manthey, and this is her game from the Australian Outback. And Jerry is a tough game to assess, as well as she was technically voting in the majority up until her boot. Though with that said, she was in a pretty rough position from pretty much the mid pre-merge on, where she was part of the initial majority on the Okakor tribe. She votes out Kel and Mad Dog without too much difficulty, and was part of the initial core alliance that consisted of her, Mitchell, and Colby. However, Colby does eventually flip during the Mitchell round to work with Tina and Keith. And from that point on, she's kind of in a non-winning spot, to where even though the Okakors do eventually get the numbers after the merge, she's in a position to where she's no longer in the core group. And this is despite her still clearly wanting to work with Colby, to where she clearly wants to take Colby deep into the game, but Colby just simply never reciprocates. And we get to the final 8, where despite there still being a few cooches left, her own group decides to turn on her, taking her out there, which is a pretty bad look. And in general, I feel like Jerry's a pretty tough game to assess, where I feel like despite her getting to the merge, and despite her technically being part of the side with the numbers, she was in a pretty bad spot within that. She wasn't really in the core of that, and she's eventually picked off, despite that not even being in the best interest of the likes of Tina and Colby, and despite her clearly wanting to take Colby deeper into the game. So I feel like Jerry's game, for the most part, is pretty rough, and you can definitely make the argument that she should be lower on this list, and in general, I kind of found her placement here hard to put together. But I feel like the fact that she was at least part of the majority for the first few rounds, it was technically part of the initial pagonging after the merge, I feel like it was just enough to have her a few spots higher to where she's here at number 24. Now moving on to number 23, and we have another person who I found very difficult to assess, and we actually have another person who will appear on this list twice. But at number 23, we do have Jonathan Penner, and this is his game from Survivor Philippines. And Penner's game on this season is also pretty rough, where he spends a lot of the game in and out of the majority group, where he is in an okay spot on the original Calabal group, to where he's part of that initial majority with Jeff Kent and Carter. However, that does start to disintegrate as the pre-merge goes along after Denise joins their tribe, and we do see him become a target during the Katie round until Carter leaks the plan to Penner, which I find pretty funny, though it did seem like Katie was probably going home with that tribal anyway. We then get to the merge where he's once again a pretty big target and at that point needs an idol to save himself, and even then is on the outs when RC goes out. That's pretty bad. And then he's blindsided once again the following round, losing Jeff Kent there. Though he's able to reintegrate a bit the following round where he's able to be a part of the eventual artist blindside, though even then he was a secondary target. And he's also successful the following round, the final 8, to take out Pete. But he's eventually taken out at the final 7, with a lot of that being his own fault as well, where he had been approached by Lisa and Scoopin about a final 3 deal, only for him to turn that down, which caused him to flip the game onto him, which is obviously a shortcoming on his end, and you do have to fault him a good amount for that. And in general, I find Penner's game here very difficult to assess, where I feel like there are many points where he was in and out of the majority group, and I feel like there's definitely a lot to blame with him when it comes to how he goes out of the game. But it's the fact that he was at least part of the majority early on, and was at least able to refine his footing after being on the outs initially after the merge, that makes me want to put him a little bit higher in this list, above the likes of Marty, for instance. But at the end of the day, I feel like his game is still pretty mediocre to where he's here at number 23. Now moving on to number 22, and we have another player who was in and out of the majority for a lot of their run, and this is despite them being a pretty active player within the game. But at number 22, we do have Q Burdett from Survivor 46, and I feel like Q fits in pretty similarly to the likes of Penner from Survivor Philippines here, where I feel like Q's game is one where he does spend a lot of the early game in the majority, where he's in a pretty good spot in the original Yanu tribe, and despite that tribe going to tribal after tribal, he's able to remain pretty safe there. Though with that said, I feel like had they gone to another tribal, he probably would have been cut over Kenzie there, so that's pretty questionable. But despite that, he does at least try to position himself better coming into the merge by forming the +1 alliance. However, that alliance crumbles pretty quickly after the merge, where he even turns against Tin Spicer, who had been pulled into that alliance during a split tribal. And then we get to the final 10, where he does end up blowing up his game by asking everyone to vote him out. And that does make him a pretty big pariah moving forward, where at the final 9, he was a secondary target during the Hunter Tribal. Final 8, he's once again being used as a smokescreen to take out Tiffany. And then final 7, same thing again. And while I can argue that this is good gameplay and the fact that Q is weaponizing himself as his pretty big shield to allow these other blindsides to go through, it's also at the expense of making himself a target to where he easily could have been taken out at any point. And we see that eventually take hold at the final 6, where he does decide to work with Maria to try to flip the game against Charlie, but they're simply outnumbered, and he ends up being taken out himself with an idol in his pocket, sort of similar to the previous few people he had taken out himself. So it is kind of a rocky game on the whole, and I do feel like him blowing up his game probably harmed his chances of winning as well, to where it would have been pretty difficult to see how he wins a jury vote at the end against most people. So I do find it to be a pretty rocky game, and one where he was being targeted during a lot of the post-merge, with a lot of it being his own fault. But it's the fact that he was at least part of the majority early on, and even after he blows up his game, is still able to last the next few rounds, was enough to have him a little bit higher to where he's here at number 22. Now moving on to number 21, and we have the other game of someone who appears on this list twice, and that is Jonathan Penner, this time talking about his game from Cook Islands. And to me, I feel like this is a slightly better game than his Philippines game, though I feel like it's still one that has a lot of similarities, where while he is in the majority, technically, for more of the game compared to Philippines, I feel like he's still not in the greatest position within that alliance, to where I feel like the likes of Yul and Becky are in much better positions compared to Penner at any point. And we even see that play out at the Mutiny, where he decides to flip over to the other tribe, which I feel like is a pretty bad move on his end, as while he wasn't in the greatest spot on the I2s to begin with, I feel like by him flipping, it just really dooms his chances of winning the game, to where even if he does flip back to the I2s, which he does after the merge, it just puts him at the bottom of that group and the first to be taken out when it comes down to the I2s. But on top of that, he doesn't even build any goodwill with the Raros, to where he becomes a pretty big target during each of the tribals that they attend afterwards. And yes, while he does survive the Brad, Rebecca, and Jenny tribals, he's still a secondary target during each of them, and is still seen as the bottom of that group, and wouldn't have gone to the end even if he had thrown out with the Raros. But even then, he flips back after the merge, further burning the Raros as well. So he really burns bridges on both sides, making himself a big target moving forward. and also ensuring that he doesn't get to the end no matter which group he ends up working with, where while he does work with the I2s moving forward, taking out Nate at the final 9 and Candace at the final 8, he doesn't really have a path to the end on that side anyway, and also would never win a jury vote even if he somehow won his way to the end, which, considering he was there with Ozzy, was pretty unlikely, and he ends up being flipped on by his group anyway at the final 7, being voted out unanimously. And yes, while there was some wonkiness with Adam threatening Yule with his jury vote by asking him to vote out Penner before him, that also speaks to how hated he was by the Raros, and further confirms that he wouldn't have won even if he had gotten to the end. So I do feel like Penner is someone who probably cooks a bit too much across the season and makes himself a big target when he probably shouldn't have. And I do feel like his game is definitely in line with his Philippines game, but it's the fact that he was technically part of the majority for more of his run compared to his Philippines game that leaves him a few spots higher, though not too much higher than number 21. Now moving on to number 20, and we have another person who was in and out of the majority of points during their run, but was still a pretty aggressive player. By number 20, we do have Joe Mena from Heroes vs. Healers vs. Hustlers. And I feel like Joe kind of fits in with the likes of Penner and Q as these people who were in and out of the majority, but were still pretty active players across their run, where he is in a pretty good spot early on the original Healers group, where he ends up finding an idol and seems to have pretty good bonds with a lot of the people there, though they don't end up going to Tribal. But then we get to the swap, where I do feel like he plays pretty sloppily there, where he ends up really sketching out Devin by lying to him about the fact that the heroes were going to target him, and it did seem like he was going to be the target there, though is able to save himself with an idol, and also gets lucked out by Devin losing his vote at that tribal as well, but he does remain a pretty big target afterwards, where even Desi talked about possibly flipping on him to avoid going to rocks. But then we get to the merge, where he is once again down numbers, where at that point the heroes and hustlers come together to target the healers, which does put him in a pretty rough spot there, and he does end up losing the likes of Jessica, Desi, and Cole there, which is all pretty bad. And he ends up scraping his way to the final 9, only for the majority to fracture at that point, and he ends up getting pulled into the JP blindside through very little work of his own, and is able to take out JP there, but then he's eventually taken out at the final 8. So it is a pretty rough track record where he is in and out of the majority across many points. Though with that said, I feel like he makes fewer blatant mistakes than Penner on either of his runs, where he doesn't have like a mutiny in Cook Islands. He doesn't have telling Scoopin and Lisa that he doesn't want to be in their final 4 plans. I feel like Joe's someone who, yes, he does make mistakes, but I feel like his mistakes aren't of the same magnitude as the likes of Penner or even Q for that matter. So it's for that reason that I'm willing to put him a little bit higher in this list, though considering that he was still in and out of the majority of points and kind of plays to his own detriment at points as well, I couldn't have him any higher than number 20. Now moving on to number 19, and we have another player who I feel like was a pretty prominent fixture in their season, but also someone who was in and out of the majority of points. But number 19, we do have Sierra Dawn Thomas, and this is her game from Survivor Game Changers. And to me, Sierra is someone who I was mostly impressed by her game, though at the same time, I feel like there were still points where she was in a bit of danger and wasn't always in the majority group. Now, I feel like early on, she was in a pretty good spot in the original Nuku, where she was able to build a pretty good bond with the likes of Brad Culpepper. There allowed her to remain pretty safe there. And she's also able to remain pretty safe after the first swap that allows her to be in the majority to take out Caleb. But then she's in a bit of danger during the joint tribal, where she does become the primary target by the other tribe, to where she does need an idol to save herself. And I would probably give Brad Culpepper the bulk of the credit for that, where I don't feel like Sierra did that much to save herself there. Though at the same time, it was a joint trouble, so there was a lot of really wonky circumstances anyway, so I'm not going to falter too much for that particular round. But then afterwards, she's able to be in the majority for the rest of the pre-merge, doesn't go back to tribal in fact. And then coming to the merge, she's able to be in a good spot initially, where she is working alongside Brad Culpepper, and she does be part of the initial plan to take out Haley. After that is also part of the alliance that takes out Ozzy, but then she's flipped on the following round, where Sarah does decide to flip to take out Debbie. She's blindsided there, and she's essentially on the bottom from that point on, where, well, she's able to scrape through the Zeke round. She is the secondary target at that tribal, and then she's taken out herself at the final 9. So I do feel like Sierra's game is one where she was actually in the majority for a decent amount of her run, and was definitely pretty consistently in the majority up until that Debbie round. But I feel like from that Debbie round on, she does lose control. And even then, I would say that Culpepper was probably more the driver of that alliance compared to Sierra. But I still feel like Sierra is someone who was definitely in the majority for at least part of her run and was able to scrape on by even after she became a target. But at the end of the day, she is still a relatively earlier boot, getting in 9th place, and also got quite a bit of votes at her season at 15, but it was enough to have her here at number 19. Now moving on to number 18, and we have the earliest boot left on the board to talk about. And I'm actually a bit surprised this person is this high, but at number 18, I did decide to go with Sierra Wright from Survivor 47. And Sierra's a weird case here, as while she is technically the top vote getter in the season at 12, all those votes came in her boot round, where she is booted at the final 10 in a position to where it was a 4-4 tie initially, and then she just voted out near unanimously on the revote. So she ends up getting 12 votes in her boot round, which is pretty interesting there, where she wasn't really a target up to that point. But I still think Sierra is someone who, despite her being an early emerge boot, still played a competent enough game where she was actually in a pretty good spot in the original Gata tribe, where she had a pretty good connection with Sam, but also had a pretty strong connection with Annika and Rachel that allowed her to essentially be in the middle during a lot of those early rounds. She takes out John Lovett on that first vote. Though I do think she gets her hands tied after Annika goes on her journey, loses her vote, but also Andy getting the amulet that essentially forced her hand into voting on Annika in the next round, which is obviously not ideal, though supposedly she was going to side with Sam even if those things didn't happen, but with those things in play, it just gave her less of an option there. But I do think she was definitely working alongside Sam during a lot of that early game. Though she does end up losing numbers after the merge, where with the way that the tribe broke down, with the Tukus like still holding strong and Andy flipping, it just made it so that she was in a pretty bad spot after that split tribal, and that resulted in then splitting the votes on Sam and Sierra at the final 10. And with Sam being seen as more of a shield compared to Sierra, it just resulted in her being taken out on the revote there. So I do feel like Sierra is someone who definitely was in a pretty good spot up until her boot. And I'm actually a bit surprised that she ended up being this high on the list, considering that she was as early boot as she was. Though at the end of the day, I feel like her game as a whole is probably less flawed compared to the people we already talked about. And I feel like the fact that she wasn't really a target up until her boot round is another major reason why I did decide to go with her above some of these other people. But at the end of the day, she was still a pretty early boot in the grand scheme of things, and her game isn't the most impressive in the world to where she's here at number 18. And moving on to number 17, and we have another person who didn't get that many votes, even though they ended up being the top vote getter of the season, but still made it pretty into the season. But number 17, we do have Jeffra from Survivor Cagayan. And Jeffra's game, for the most part, is fine, where she's able to remain the majority for most of her run, but isn't really that much of a power player within that, and was obviously still a target at certain points. Where early on, she's in a pretty good spot in the original Beauty tribe, where she's part of the eventual Bryce blindside, the one tribal they go to before the swap. After that, she's given a pretty bad swap, where her and LJ are the only beauties on a tribe of mostly bronze, but they're able to work that to their favor to where they eventually blindside Cliff Robinson. And through that, she's able to get to the merge, where she does become the target from the other side, mostly because she was the least likely person to have an idol played on her, though is largely saved by cast flipping, which didn't really have much to do with what Jeffra was doing, but through that, her side is able to get the numbers, and they're able to pick off Morgan the following round. However, she then blindsided the final 9, where Tony decides to flip to take out LJ. She was let out that plan, leading into the final 8, where she does consider flipping against Tony, though later backs out of it, votes out Jeremiah, which wasn't really in her best interest, and she's eventually taken out the final 7 once Tony flips again, due to him thinking that she wasn't loyal to him. So I feel like on the whole, Jeffra's game is just kind of fine, where she was in the majority for most of it. She was able to recover from a bad swap and was able to take the numbers after the merge. Though at the same time, I feel like Jeffra herself wasn't leading a lot of the action. I feel like she was mostly there for the ride. And even then, I feel like she got outplayed by Tony by the end of it. So at the end of the day, it was kind of hard to have her too much higher on the list, but it's the fact that she was able to be in the majority for most of her run and was able to get all the way to the final 7 without too much difficulty that leaves her here at number 17. Now moving on to number 16, and we have another player who I feel like their game is mostly fine, but not overly dominant. But number 16, we're going to the new era, and here we have Franny from Survivor 44. And again, I feel like Franny's game for the most part is pretty competent, though she ends up being a pretty big target by the end of it. Early on, she's pretty safe on the Soka tribe, where she obviously has a very good bond with Matt, but is able to be seen as a pretty social player. Though with that said, they only attend one tribal before the merge, and she does technically not get her way there, where she does try to save Claire, but eventually backs down from that plan, but is able to remain pretty safe. After the merge, she continues to work with the Sokas, though gets very unfortunate by the split tribal that results in her losing Matt, who was her closest ally at that point, and she's targeted the following round by the Ratus, and is technically saved by an idol, though in reality the Tikas were working with the Sokas in that round, and only voted for Franny because they knew that Danny was going to use the idol on Franny, so I don't really knock her that much for that round, outside the fact that she was targeted to begin with. And moving forward, she continues to work within the Soka power structure, despite that not even being beneficial to her at that point, where the likes of Danny and Heidi were better positioned within that. And while she tries to flip the game against the Tikas, knowing that they were playing the middle, she's just unsuccessful in getting anyone on board with that, which is also pretty bad. And she ends up becoming the biggest target on the board when the Tikas decide to flip at the final 8. And yes, while she did build this type bond with Carolyn that could have given her an option in the game, that also plays into why she is the first to go when the Tikas flip, as she's obviously the closest to Carolyn and was the biggest danger to the Tikas losing their advantage in the game. So I do feel like Franny was someone who, despite being the majority for a lot of it, was someone who didn't really get her way at many points, and is someone who ultimately became this pretty massive threat in the game by the time of her boot at the final 8. So it was a pretty tough game to assess, but it's the fact that she was in the majority up until her boot that led to her being here at number 16. Now moving on to number 15, and this person probably had less win equity than the likes of Franny, for instance, but was in the majority for more of her run, and also had a bit more flexibility in their game. But number 15, we are sticking with the new era, and here we have Liana from Survivor 41. And Liana is someone who I feel like played a pretty interesting game, all things considered, where she was in the majority pretty much up until her boot, though obviously does lose control by the end of it, where early on she's in a pretty good spot in the original Yase, where she's part of the Women's Alliance there, and that they're able to take control of those first few votes, taking out Abraham and Boche, and they also had Xander there to take out had they gone to another tribal. So I do feel like Liana was positioned pretty well in the pre-merge, and she's also able to build a type bond with Shien during the journey she goes on that really pays dividends for her after the merge, where after the merge, despite the Yases being down in numbers and being these easy targets early on, Liana's able to avoid all that, where through her connection with Shien, she's able to be pulled into the new Black Alliance that is able to control a lot of the early votes after the merge. And while I could say that this is due to stuff outside of Liana's control, like the fact that she was able to go on this journey with Shien, and even beyond that, there was the political climate that was happening outside the game at the time, it still led to Liana being in a pretty good spot after the merge. And I feel like had that alliance been able to stick together, that Liana would have been in a pretty good spot to get towards the end of the game, where I feel like Shien would have been willing to take Liana very deep into the season. Though with that said, I feel like Liana probably would have lost to Shien, and in general, I do question Liana's win equity, as it didn't seem like she was the most well-respected player in the world, especially with her flipping against her old tribe there. And even then, her game does crumble at the final 8, where Erica and Ricard do flip the game against Shien, leaving Liana on the outs, and she is ultimately taken out the final 7 after Danny wins immunity and Deshawn doesn't die. So Liana was technically the 3rd target on the board, which is obviously unlucky, though even then she was already on the bottom regardless. So it is kind of a weird game to assess, where Liana was in the majority up until her boot pretty much, where she was in the majority in their original tribe, but even then has the wherewithal to flip against her tribe once they were down in numbers, and was able to get into a position to where, had the Black Alliance held true, that she would have been in a good spot to get towards the end, where it does seem like Shien would have been willing to take her towards the end of the game, though obviously win equity would have been a major issue for Liana there. But it's the fact that she was in the majority up until her boot, and does technically make an active move by flipping against her old tribe, that leaves her a few spots higher to where she's here at number 15. Now moving on to number 14, and we're going from the new era to one of the earliest seasons left on the board to talk about. But number 14, we have Stephanie LaGrossa from Survivor Palau. And Stephanie's a weird case here, as she ended up attending a bevy of tribals across her season, with her being part of the Oolong tribe, and them basically losing every single immunity challenge. And I feel like that's a major factor for Stephanie here, the fact that she essentially survived an entire oolonging and not really being targeted for a lot of that pre-merge there, which I do find somewhat impressive. And also with her mostly voting within the majority, where I believe the only time she doesn't vote correctly during the pre-merge is during the Angie tribal, where even then it was a tie and she ended up flipping to Angie on the revote. And it seemed like she was in a pretty good spot on the Oolong tribe for most of the pre-merge. Though with that said, I would probably say Bobby John was in a better position compared to her, where Bobby John, the likes of James and Ibrahim having this Alabama connection, And there was definitely a shot that the game could have flipped on her when it was down to the final 4 of that tribe, though she's able to remain pretty safe there and is even able to survive the final 3 to where it was her and Bobby John. At that point, that came down to a fire making challenge where supposedly she lost at first and they end up redoing the challenge. And again, I'm not going to assess that too much, but she does end up surviving Oolong. She's able to get all the way to the merge just by her attending all those tribals, and is able to get to the merge in an interesting spot where, while she was seen as his relatively easy target, there was still options for her where she did have a connection to Tom from the early days before their tribe came together. And even then, you had Kobe, who wanted to flip the game against Tom and was considered a swing vote for that. So I do feel like Stephanie was at least in an interesting spot for that first vote, even though she does ultimately vote out Kobe there. But then we get to the final 8 where she was the primary target at that point, and it did seem like she was about to be voted out until Janu quit the game. And obviously there was some wonkiness there with Janu saying that she was quitting to give Stephanie another chance, though at the same time, Janu was already on the bottom anyway, and I figured she just wanted to give up. So again, not really sure what to make of that. But then we get to the final 7 where she is targeted once again and is eventually taken out. Though even then, there was still this talk about this potential flip with the women, only for that to fall apart. So I didn't feel like Stephanie was still able to make it a couple rounds into the merge, despite her being the only member from her original tribe left. In general, the fact that she was able to survive all those tribals in the pre-merge without being targeted that much is still pretty impressive in my eyes. And I do consider Stephanie to be one of the more impressive players on this entire list. But at the end of the day, she was still only 7th place. And even then, I feel like she wasn't the most dominant player in the world, even when she was on the Oolong tribe, outside just being in a good position, which is why I do have to leave her behind here at number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and we're moving on now to another grouping of players, as these are all pretty big power players in my view on their seasons, and all of them were taken out around like the mid-merge, and it was just a matter of ordering them. But at number 13, we have the earliest boot of this grouping, and here we have the other game of Laura Moret, this time her game from Survivor Samoa. And Laura is an interesting case here, as sort of similar to a few other people we talked about. All her votes came in her boot round, which ended up being a tie situation, which further inflated her vote count. So her status on this list is also a bit questionable, though at the same time, it was also in a position to where she was rarely eligible to be voted for to begin with, where she only attended one tribal before the merge, and then she won the first 2 immunity challenges after the merge, with her boot round being the first round after the merge where she was even eligible to be voted for. So again, even her position there is a bit questionable, but she was at least in a good spot in the original Galoo, where she was essentially the leader of the women's alliance that came together there and seemed to have control of the numbers on that side of things, where they end up voting out Yasmin at the one tribal they go to, and then after Russell Swan gets pulled from the game, she's in a pretty good spot within the Galoo tribe, and had they been able to hold the numbers after the merge and picked off the old Foafoas, Laura would have been in a pretty good spot to get towards the end of the game, as it did seem like she had a good bond with the likes of Kelly, Brett, and Dave Ball, though obviously they do fracture after the merge, where they do end up picking off Eric Cardona first, who was towards the bottom of the Galoos anyway, but then afterwards, they do try to target Russell Hance, only for Russell to find another idol Kelly, and probably would have targeted Laura had Laura not won immunity there, so that's a bit hairy as well. But then we get to the final 10, where she is the target from the Foafoa side, though even then, even with Russell like campaigning to Shambo and John Fincher, it was only a 5-5 tie. Now granted, John did promise to flip on the revote if it was a tie, but so technically she already didn't have the numbers there and would have gone home regardless. But still, it was in a spot to where they did have the numbers coming into the merge. They do get unlucky by the fact that Russell found an idol and was able to take out Kelly, who was one of Laura's closest allies. And I do think had the Galoos been able to keep their act together, or at the very least take out Russell along the way, that I feel like Laura would have been in a pretty good spot to get to the end, and who knows if she would have won had she gotten there. So I do feel like Laura was actually a pretty good player on this season at least, and was in a pretty good spot, though obviously they do end up giving up their advantage, and there was just enough opportunities to take out Laura along the way, not to mention the fact that she was already a target by the Foafoas coming to the merge. That makes it hard for me to have her too much higher, and also the fact that she's only 10th place. So for that reason, I can't really have her any higher than number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we have another person who was a pretty big power player on their season, and while they weren't as consistently in the majority compared to Laura, I feel like they have a few more major pros going for them. But number 12, we do have Zeke from Survivor Millennials vs. Gen X. And I feel like Zeke was a pretty big player across a lot of his season, though there were still some rockiness within that, where early on he is part of the initial majority on the Millennials tribe until Hannah flips on them at the first tribal they go to, loses Mari there, which is obviously not great. However, he's able to recover pretty well afterwards. He's able to remain safe until the swap. After the swap, he is down in numbers initially, though he's able to build good enough bonds with David and Chris to remain pretty safe, and they take out Cece at the next tribal they go to. And then after the merge, he's able to once again be part of the majority group, where they're able to pick off the likes of Michelle and Taylor early on, and is even able to pull off the Chris blindside at the final 11, though it's at the final 10 that he decides to flip by essentially pulling in the people who were previously in the minority to create a new majority alliance that is able to go head to head against David, and they're able to go to rocks at the final 10, which is pretty good there. Now, supposedly, Will actually was going to consider flipping, but ultimately backed out due to him thinking that Jessica was also going to flip. But either way, this was still a pretty impressive feat on Zeke's end, and they are able to win the rock draw there by taking out Jessica, though it also makes him a pretty big target moving forward, and he is ultimately taken out at the final 9 after Will decides to flip as a way of enacting his pendulum strategy. But I still find Zeke's game somewhat impressive due to him being this pretty big power player, someone who was able to be in the majority for a lot of it, was able to ride the middle during a lot of the early merge. And while I think his flip at the final 10 made him a pretty big target and made it pretty unlikely that he was going to get to the very end, I still respect the move, and the fact that he was able to get this group to go to rocks for him this early in the game is still pretty impressive, and definitely a bigger pro for him than a lot of the other people that we've talked about on this list. But at the end of the day, he is still only 9th place, and I still think he struggled quite a bit with threat management, which obviously explains why he was a big target for a lot of the game, which is why he's here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we have yet another pretty notable player on their season, someone who made it pretty deep into the season and someone who was in the majority for a lot of it. By number 11, we do have Crystal Cox from Survivor Gabon, who received 11 votes against her. And again, I feel like Crystal is someone who, despite her being a pretty big target for a lot of the season, was able to be in a pretty big power position for a lot of it, where she was in the majority for most of her run, where early on she is in a pretty good spot in the original Fong tribe, and while it's a joke that she sucked at challenges despite being an Olympic athlete, she's still able to remain pretty safe, being able to be part of the majority there. After the swap, she's also pretty safe, at least at first, where they take out the likes of Jackie, GC, and Kelly, though at the same time, it also seemed like Ace and Maddie had the better relationship with Sugar compared to her and Kenny, and it seemed for a lot of it that Sugar was going to side with them to take out Crystal as they got into another tribal, though Sugar does end up flipping for some reason to keep Crystal in the game over Ace, which I'm not really sure how much credit to give Crystal for that, as it did seem like Sugar just flipped because she's Sugar, but she does tend to get saved by a wonky circumstance there, and she also gets pretty fortunate by the second swap that opens it up for Marcus to be sniped out of the game. However, through that, her side does come into the merge with the numbers, and they are able to take control for the next few rounds, taking out Charlie, Randy, and Corinne. Though with that said, I think her and Kenny also make a pretty clear mistake at the final 7, where while they had the numbers to take out Corinne, they tell the remaining Onion Alliance members to put their votes onto Maddie to make him the secondary target, which just makes it clear that Maddie is on the bottom and causes him to flip at the final 6 along with Sugar, and Crystal sniped out of the game that way. So I do have to falter a good amount for that, and while I think Kenny probably deserves more of the blame, as I feel like Kenny was the more active player between the duo, I think that also speaks to how Crystal was the beta to Kenny for a lot of the game, where I feel like Kenny was more responsible for a lot of the moves that they were making and probably would have beaten Crystal had they gone to the end together. And I think on top of that, the fact that she allowed Maddie to flip the final 6, and beyond that was the secondary target during the Ace Tribal, where she was in a lot of danger there. I think there's definitely a bit of wonkiness to Crystal's game in that regard, but either way, I still think that Crystal was still a pretty big player in the season, working alongside Kenny for a lot of it, and they were able to take control of the game after the merge when it did seem like that this Onion Alliance was destined to steamroll a lot of the post-merge. But I still have to give Crystal a good amount of credit for that, and the fact that she's able to get to the final 6 is all pretty good. But I feel like it's those major knocks that are what is keeping her from being higher on the list for me, which is why she's here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and this is another player who I feel like was a pretty big presence across her season, and while they weren't like the strategic mastermind and obviously struggled a lot with threat management, they were still someone that had a lot of win equity on their season. By number 10, we do have Christian Hubicki from David vs. Goliath, who got 18 votes against him during the season. And obviously Christian was pretty hard to assess in the fact that he was a pretty big target for a lot of the post-merge. And even beyond that, I don't think he was necessarily the driver a lot of the action for what the Davids were doing. But with that said, I still feel like he was in the majority for a decent amount of his run and had a ton of win equity on the season. Where early on, he does seem to be pretty safe on the original David tribe, where he has plenty of connections there, or he and Nick are able to be pretty major swing votes during the Jessica P tribal. After the swap, while he is down in numbers, he's able to build pretty good bonds with the other Goliaths and Dan and John Hennigan that's able to keep him pretty safe during that stretch of the game. But then after the merge, he is technically down in numbers, where while there was this talk about this Strike Force alliance that he gets pulled into that crumbles pretty quickly, and the Davids are forced to cut one of their own and Elizabeth there. At the final 12, he's a pretty big target from the Goliaths and needs to be saved by an idol there, which is obviously not great. However, at the same time, he's also pulled into the minority vote split, where they are able to pull out this pretty impressive maneuver in taking out John Hennigan. And while I want to give Christian the most amount of credit for that move, where I feel like the likes of Nick and Davey probably deserve more credit, Christian was still technically part of that plan, so I do have to give him some credit for that. And then afterwards, he is once again a target, though at least this time has the numbers to stay there, where Dan was the clear target there. At the final 10, they're able to take out Alec without too much difficulty. At the final 9, he and Gabby are pretty big swing votes at that tribal, and they do decide to flip to the Mike White side to blindside Carl. That's pretty good. But I think his game from the final 8 on is pretty rocky. We're at the final 8. Gabby does decide to flip on him, and she is able to pull in the other Davids to blindside him, and while he's able to recognize that and play an idol to save himself, he's also blindsided by the actual Gabby blindside, where Mike and Angelina do decide to put votes on the Gabby to take her out, and Christian has no clue this is coming. That's pretty bad there. And then at the final 7, he's just taken out himself. So I do feel like Christian's game at the end is pretty rocky, and in general, it's kind of hard to assess Christian's game, where I feel like for the most part, he was a pretty consistent target during a lot of that post-merge, simply due to how likable he is and just how inherent of a jury threat he seemed to be. He also needs 2 idols to save himself, which is definitely a lot. And the fact that he was blindsided at the final 8 when he was the primary target to begin with is also not particularly great. But even then, I still think Christian was a pretty big player across a lot of his season. And while I don't think he is the most dominant player in the world, I still think there were some moments where he had agency, particularly at that final 9 round where he and Gabby were the swing votes there. Also earlier on, he was a swing vote during the Jessica P tribal. I do think Christian is definitely a pretty big player at points, and while he wasn't that much to do with the actual John Hennigan blindside at the final 12 where he was targeted there, I still think Christian's game for the most part is pretty solid. That and also he wins if he gets to the end, where considering that he had managed to get all the way to the final 7 despite being this pretty big target is pretty noteworthy, and I feel like he definitely wins if he gets to the end. Though at the end of the day, he's still only 7th place, and the fact that he needed 2 L's to get to the final 7 is pretty rocky, which is why he's here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we're now moving on to 3 players in a row that all made it very deep into the game or had a lot of win equity, even though their actual path through the game is pretty questionable. But number 9, we have someone who very much epitomizes this grouping, and number 9, we do have Lydia from Survivor Guatemala, who received 10 votes against her, and Lydia is someone who probably would have won had she gotten to the end, where she got all the way to the final 4, just need to get through 2 more rounds. Though with that said, I think you can argue that she should be lower because it was pretty unlikely she was even going to get to the end, considering how the final immunity challenge was structured. Beyond that, she didn't really have anyone who's going to take her to the end. Beyond that, I think her actual game is kind of rough, where while she was in the majority for a lot of it, she didn't really have that much control in how that alliance navigated through the game. Where early on, while she is pretty well liked and someone who is able to get through the Morgan and Brianna rounds alright, she was also being targeted by them due to her being the perceived challenge weakness was not great, and she was also targeted during the Brook round after the swap, but was able to scrape through that. And then after the merge, she's up in numbers simply due to her tribe having the numbers, and at that point they're able to pick off the outsiders one by one, though again, she's not really a power player within a lot of that. I feel like more so Rafe and Stephanie are driving a lot of the action there, and it was very unlikely she was going to get to the end, even had that group gone all the way down together. But even then, the final 6, she's a secondary target when Judd's being taken out, and she's eventually taken out final 4 over Danny, who was a much bigger physical threat compared to Lydia and was more likely to win final immunity compared to Lydia, so I feel like that's another knock against her game. So I do feel like Lydia's game is, for the most part, pretty bad, where I feel like despite her being the majority for a lot of it, she was a pretty passive player and someone who was targeted at points due to her, like, either not being super well positioned or due to her being seen as his challenge weakness. But the main reason why she is as high as she is one, the fact that she did get to the Final Four, at least that's something to mention, but also her win equity, where it did seem like she would have beaten everyone except for Danny at the end. So I feel like that's another thing to prop her up here. So again, it's the fact that she at least had a shot of winning the game that leaves her at least as high, but I feel like her navigation through the game was pretty mediocre. And even beyond that, I don't think she really had a path to getting to the end anyway. So it's for that reason that I had to leave her at the bottom of this grouping to where she's here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have another person who made it very deep into the season and also had a lot of win equity, but at the same time their navigation was pretty rough. And at number 8 we do have Ozzy from Survivor South Pacific, who ends up getting voted out 3 times over the course of the season, which obviously inflates his vote count here to where he finishes the season with 17 votes against him, which is definitely a lot. But again, I feel like he fits in with Lydia, someone who did at least get to the Final Four, even though it was due to Redemption Island, and also someone that had a lot of win equity on the season, though how much of that was due to his actual gameplay is questionable. Now, if we're looking at his game early on, he was definitely part of the majority on the original Savaii, though I don't think he was really in control of that group, where I feel like it was more so the likes of Jim, Keith, and Whitney that were more so driving the action there. And I feel like there were multiple points where Ozzy doesn't get his way, where early on he wants to keep Semhar around, though Semhar gets voted out. He also is blindsided during the Elise vote, where Elise was closer to him. So I do feel like Ozzy's someone who, while being safe due to him like being this figurehead and someone who was an anchor for his tribe and challenges, I feel like he wasn't really getting his way in a lot of situations, and had the game played out more naturally, he probably would have been cut along the way anyway. So then we get to the last round before the merge, where he does ask his try to be voted out, which is obviously a good move in the sense that while he is technically getting voted out, it's also in a spot to where he's doing it so that he can go to Redemption Island, win the duel, get back into the game, and ensure that his tribe comes into the merge tied in numbers, which he's effectively able to do. Though at the same time, he also mismanages Cochran, that results in Cochran flipping and gets completely outplayed in that situation, and it's just taken out very quickly after Keith there. And from that point on, he spends most of the merge on Redemption Island, just winning duels and surviving that way, while at the same time not really playing the game of Survivor, which is obviously a pretty massive knock to him there. And he's only able to come back at the Final 5, where he is 2 rounds away from winning the game, and does win the Final 5 immunity challenge, meaning that he was only 1 challenge away from winning the game, but he obviously doesn't. He loses a challenge, gets voted out there, but had he won that last challenge, he does win the game, where he would have beaten everyone left on the board. So at least that's something to consider, and that's obviously a major reason why he is this high on the list, is the fact that he was 1 round away from winning the game. And I feel like that's more than I can say for Lydia, to where, yes, while Lydia is a likely winner had she gotten to the end, I feel like she didn't really have any realistic path to getting there. I feel like Ozzy had a much more reasonable path to getting there, considering he was literally just 1 challenge away, and with Ozzy being a much better challenge competitor, he at least had a shot of getting that through, though obviously he fails to do so. But I feel like that's a major reason why he is at least above Lydia for me. But at the end of the day, I feel like their games are still pretty mediocre, and is really only this high due to his win equity and how close he was to winning the game, to where he's here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have someone who got all the way to the end of the game, but didn't have any win equity upon getting there, but he was at least part of the majority the entire time. But number 7, we do have Philip Shepard from Redemption Island, and I'm sure some people will have Philip much lower on this list for obvious reasons, with Philip not being a particularly good player, not being a particularly well-liked player on the season, where he obviously finishes the season with 17 votes against him as well. But he does get to the very end and was in the majority for almost the entire season. Now, he is on the bottom of the original Ometepe, where he's initially this outcast. However, he is eventually pulled into Boston Rob's alliance and ends up voting out Christina, the 3rd tribal they go to. And from that point on, he is working alongside Boston Rob the rest of the season. Now, mind you, a lot of that is due to Boston Rob dragging Philip to the end, as he knows that he can beat Philip, and Philip doesn't really do much to flip it, where, yes, well, he does have a few moments on the show of making it seem like he would flip. He never actually pulls the trigger, which is obviously a knock there. And he does do things that harm his relationships, where you have the whole Rice Wars situation, which obviously burns his relationships with the Zapateras. And even beyond that, he ends up annoying a lot of the Ometepe women as well. That makes it less likely he'll do well against Rob. And he does ultimately get to the end with Rob in a spot to where he ends up propping up Rob at a lot of Final Tribal. So again, I'm not saying Philip is a good player by any means, but he did still get to the end. He did vote in the majority for almost the entire season. He was part of the majority alliance, and yes, while he doesn't do anything to counteract that, and actively burns his relationships along the way. I feel like it's that fact that, and also he gets to the end. I feel like those things are a major reason why he is on the list. But at the end of the day, he still played a pretty passive game, and he obviously does things that causes him to lose at the end, but still it was enough to have him here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have another person who made it pretty deep into the season, and while they weren't in control for a lot of the post-merge, I feel like their game outside of that is somewhat impressive. At number 6, we do have Rupert Boneham from Survivor Heroes vs. Villains, who does end the season with the most votes against him at 10, which is funny considering that all those votes came in his last 3 tribals. And while I still wouldn't consider Rupert's game to be that elite in the grand scheme of things, I feel like for this list, it is one of the better ones on the board, where I actually feel like he was in a pretty good spot for a lot of the pre-merge, where on the original Heroes group, he seemed to be in a fine enough spot, voting the majority there, never really being in much danger of going home. And while I wouldn't consider him a dominant player by any means, I still feel like he is someone who plays well enough considering the circumstances. And obviously the heroes lose control after the merge, and from that point on, Rupert is on the bottom, though I think Rupert plays well enough from the bottom to where he ends up being one of the last heroes to be targeted. And he does have some impressive plays along the way, like tricking everyone into thinking that he had an idol by sticking a rock in his pocket. I feel like that's at least somewhat worth mentioning. And he does ultimately make it to the final 6, where he gets taken at that point, where I feel like had he gotten to the end from that point on, he probably is a somewhat likely winner, where I feel like he for sure beats Parvati and Russell there. So I do feel like Rupert's game on the season is not that bad in this grand scheme of things, where I feel like there's definitely some impressive play there, and the fact that he does get to the final 6 in the position that he's in is at least somewhat noteworthy, though at the end of the day, I feel like I can't really have many higher than number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and for me, this was the pretty clear top 5, and it was just a matter of ordering them. But number 5, we have someone who got pretty deep into the game, and while they were idled out, I still feel like their game beyond that was pretty good. But number 5, we do have Baylor from Survivor San Juan del Sur, who was a pretty clear vote magnet on the season, getting 17 votes against her, but I feel like her game beyond that is, for the most part, solid. Now, she is in a rough spot in the original Kyopa tribe, where while she does vote for Nadia at that first tribal, she immediately becomes a secondary target during the Val tribal, where it ended up going to a 4-4 tie, and while Val was a clear target on the revote, I still feel like that was a hairy spot for Baylor there. And even beyond that, while she does vote out John Rocker, she would have been in a rough spot had they ever gone back to tribal. But then she gets a pretty good swap where she gets reunited with her mom, and from that point on, are able to pull in John and Jacqueline to take out the Wentworths back to back. And then from the merge on, they're able to be in a pretty good spot, being part of the majority and taking out a lot of the big threats in Josh and Jeremy. Also takes out Reed at the final 8. And then eventually being part of the plan to break up John and Jacqueline at the final 6, and had a pretty easy target in Keith coming to final 5 until Keith won immunity, but even then they had the numbers to flip the vote against Jacqueline. But then obviously Natalie decides to flip the game on Baylor by playing her idol on Jacqueline and sniping out Baylor in the process, which is obviously pretty unfortunate and largely was facilitated by Keith winning immunity to begin with. Though at the same time, I think Baylor also had very little win equity on the season, to where even if she'd gotten to the end, she probably would have lost, considering that a lot of the jury didn't seem to respect her. And even then, I think Missy would have had more respect compared to Baylor, which I think was saying a lot, considering the jury didn't like Missy either. So I do think Baylor is someone who definitely played a solid game from the swap on, though at the same time had very little win equity by the end of it, and was technically sniped out at the final 5 in a spot to where she probably should have gotten to at least final 4. But at the end of the day, I feel like it's a lack of win equity. Also, the fact that she had a pretty rough start to her season is what leaves her behind here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we have another person who had a lot of agency in the game, but also 0 win equity by the end of it. But number 4, we do have Lillian Morris from Survivor Pearl Islands. And I think her status on this list is helped out by the fact that she was voted out and came back into the game, where she ends up finishing the season with 10 votes against her. And I think there's similarities here between Lillian and Baylor in the sense that both of them had pretty rough starts to the season, but really turned it on after the merge here, where early on she's on the bottom of the original Morgan tribe, where while she does vote out Nicole at that first tribal, she's then on the outs when Skinny Ryan goes out, loses one of her allies there, and then is immediately voted out afterwards herself. And obviously comes back into the game at the merge due to the outcast twist, where from that point on, she becomes a pretty critical swing vote during a lot of those votes afterwards, where afterwards the tribes are tied in numbers, but ends up flipping against her old tribe to take out Andrew Savage, also votes with the Drakes to take out Rhino at the next tribal. But then afterwards, she ends up flipping with Burton and Johnny Fairplay to take out Rupert and is in control afterwards, but it's pretty clearly the third within that alliance, where I feel like Burton and Fairplay would taking each other to the end over Lil. And to her credit, she does pick up on this, which results in her flipping at the final 5 to take out Burton, and eventually takes out Fairplay at the final 3 to where both Fairplay and Sandra were going to take her to the end. Though with that said, she had pretty much no win equity in the season, where obviously a lot of people in the season didn't like her and found her pretty annoying, so that inherently would have made it very difficult for her to win. But also, a lot of the cast didn't respect the Outcast twist itself, to where that also very much harmed her chances of winning. And even if she had gotten to the end with Burton, she would have lost to him as well. So Lil is someone who pretty much couldn't win the season. And I also think that played a factor in why she was in as good a position as she was, where it very much felt like people were comfortable taking her deeper into the game, knowing that they could just beat her at the end as well. Not to mention the fact that Lil was a pretty emotional player and someone who seemed to flip more so due to emotional reasons than her recognizing her position in the game. So I do feel like there's a lot of faults to Lil's game and how she navigated through it, but I think it's the fact that she at least got to the end and was still in a good position, even though she had no win equity in the season, that leaves her as high on the list as she is. Though with that said, I feel like it's those massive knocks against her that leave her behind here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we have yet another pretty massive player in their season and someone who came relatively close to winning at the end. By number 3, we do have Kelly Wentworth from Survivor Cambodia, who ends up getting quite a bit of votes here at 17, but was also a pretty notable player on their season and someone who got all the way to the final 4, though it was still a pretty rocky ride throughout, where early on she was in a pretty okay spot on her original Takeo tribe, where she votes out both Vias and Shireen, but then she gets 2 pretty bad swaps where it did seem like she would have been voted out had they gone to tribal any of them, but is able to avoid tribal all the way to the merge. We then get to the merge where she's not really in the majority at that point, and while she does vote out Cass, it was also in a spot to where she was cutting one of her own allies there, which is not particularly great. And then we get to the final 12, where she is the primary target there and has to use an idol to save herself, negating 9 votes there, which is obviously a pretty noteworthy stat there. But I think she recovers well enough from that situation where she does idol out Savage. She then forms the Witch's Coven that is able to remain the majority at the following round to take out Kelly Wigglesworth. At the final 10, they are a pretty integral force in shifting the votes onto Stephen Fishback and had the numbers to take him out, only for Jeremy to save Stephen with an idol, taking out Sierra, which is obviously not great for Wentworth's game. At the final 9, they do pull the trigger on Stephen, working alongside Spencer at that point, which is pretty good. And they're able to take out Joe at the final 8. So I do feel like Wentworth is able to play pretty well, despite her having been this target at the final 12 to where she needed an idol to save herself. But I think from the final 7 on, she is essentially on the bottom from that point on, where at the final 7, she does lose Ave Maria. That's not particularly great. At the final 6, while she's able to convince Kimmy to flip on Jeremy, it's also in a spot to where Jeremy does ultimately play his idol, and Wentworth is the target from Jeremy's side. She has to play an idol there as well. That's not particularly great. And even then loses Kimmy on the consensus stage of things. At the final 5, she needs to win immunity. That's not particularly great. And then final 4, she's just taken out at that point as the pretty easy target there. So it is kind of a rocky game where I feel like there are definitely points throughout a lot of the game where Wentworth is on the bottom and is barely surviving. She once again has to use 2 idols to get through a lot of the game, sort of similar to Christian from earlier on in the list. And again, I think there's definitely a lot to criticize with Wentworth's game. However, I still think she was able to recover pretty well from the Savage blindside through the final 8, was able to be in the majority there. And I also think she had a lot of win equity on the season, to where I feel like had she gotten to the end against anyone other than Jeremy, she probably wins that season handily. So I think it's those pros that really elevate Wentworth this high on the list, and definitely one of the reasons why she's one of the more impressive people to be the top vote getter on their season. But I still feel like there are 2 people that edge her out for me, which is why she's here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and to me there was a very obvious top 2, and even within that, I think there was a somewhat obvious order to that top 2. But at number 2, I decided to go with Aubrey Bracco from Survivor Co. Wrong. And I think Aubrey's game is definitely one of the more impressive ones in Survivor history, where she obviously plays a pretty dominant game from the post-merge on, gets all the way to the end, but obviously fails to win at the end, which is definitely noteworthy there. Though I think if we're looking at her game before that, it is interesting to say the least, where early on she is kind of on the bottom of the original Brains tribe, has a slow start there, though is able to slowly build bonds that allow her to remain pretty safe there. And she does vote out Liz at the one tribal they go to before this swap. And then even after the swap, she is able to once again be in a pretty good spot there, vote out Anna and Peter. Though it's at the merge that I would say is probably the rockiest point of her game, where it did seem like she was going to be targeted alongside Neil, and with Neil having an idol, it did seem likely that had they gone to tribal at that point, that she probably would have been in a lot of danger going out, though kind of gets fortunate by Neil getting medevac, which is obviously kind of a weird situation as she does technically lose her closest ally and Neil also takes the idol with him. But it also does allow Aubrey to have this reset that allows her to really regroup afterwards and eventually is able to work alongside the woman to take out Nick at the next tribal. They then flip to take out Debbie, and then they flip again to take out the likes of Scott, Julia, and Jason, with Aubrey in particular being a pretty critical point of that, where she's able to convince Ty to flip when he had been working with Scott, Julia, and Jason before. But through that, Aubrey's able to run the rest of the game, being able to get all the way to the end. And she does get pretty unlucky by Joe getting medevac at the final 5, and then Michelle winning final 4 immunity. That does ultimately result in her losing the game at the end, where she does lose a jury vote to Michelle. But I still look at Aubrey's game as pretty strong, where I feel like from the post-merge on, I feel like Aubrey plays a pretty dominant game. And I definitely think she's definitely one of the more impressive runners-up in Survivor history, despite her being the top vote-getter on her season. And that's obviously a major reason why she is this high on the list, where I feel like she is a pretty big power player in the season, is someone who's able to get all the way to the end despite her being the top vote getter on her season, and someone who I know a lot of people think should have won her season. So I think those are all pretty big factors in why she's this high on the list. And obviously she is one of the better players in this category of players. But I still think there's one player who I would probably have above her in the grand scheme of things. So despite her playing a really impressive game on her season, I do have to leave her behind here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person who believe played the best game of the people who got the most votes against them on their season is Aris, which I'm sure some people will find underwhelming. However, Aris is the only winner in Survivor history up to this point to also be the top vote getter on their season, which is interesting as I believe Ben actually has more votes against him on HHH. However, Joe obviously got more votes than Ben. However, Aris is the top vote getter on his season, receiving 9 votes against him, and obviously the fact that he's a winner is a major reason why he is very high on this list. Though I think if we are looking at his game, while it's definitely one that I've criticized in the past, I feel like it's one that is pretty stable for the most part, where I feel like Aris is able to essentially be in the majority for most of his run, where on the original men's tribe, he is able to remain pretty safe due to them being the younger men. And then after the Kasaya tribe comes together, he's able to be part of the majority alliance, is able to run a lot of that tribe. Now, I think within that, there is some wonkiness, like the fact that he tells Melinda that she's going home. Also, the fact that he is technically on the outs during the Bob Dog vote and even got a vote against him from that tribal from Shien. Also, the fact that he didn't have the greatest relationships in the world with the likes of Bruce, for instance. There's definitely sloppiness from Aris, but he is still within the majority the entire time, where he has a very close bond with Sari. Also is able to hold the rest of the alliance together in the likes of Danielle and Shien to where they're able to hold the numbers there. And then coming to the merge, their tribe has the numbers to where they're just able to pick off the remaining Laminas one by one. And while he is the secondary target during the Austin and Sally tribals, they simply have the numbers to get through that. Now there's also the fact that Terry has this big immunity run where he's immune pretty much up until the final 3. And while that's unlucky in the sense that they're unable to take out Terry, and it also meant that Terry was 1 round away from winning the game, I think for Aris in particular, I think Terry staying around was actually pretty good for him, as I feel like Aris is the type of person that would typically be targeted around the mid-merge due to him being this big challenge threat, but because Terry kept winning these immunities, that his alliance was less likely to turn on him as they felt like they needed him to beat Terry in challenges. So I do think Aris gets pretty benefited from that. And also at the final 6, at the point where Terry was the only Lamina left and he was immune, I do feel like he, Sari, and Danielle pull out this pretty impressive move and pulling up the 3-2-1 to take out Courtney. And granted, Aris was technically in danger in this tribal where he did get 2 of the votes there. He was still able to be part of this big plan that ensured that him, Sari, and Danielle got to the final 5 with the numbers, and they do take out Shien at the final 5. Final 4, he ends up winning immunity, though he does lose Sari in the fire making challenge, and it gets to a final 3 where at least he has Danielle there, and as long as Terry doesn't win immunity, he's pretty guaranteed for final 2, and sure enough, they're able to take out Terry, and he ends up winning at the end. So I feel like in a lot of ways, Aris's game is pretty self-explanatory, and while I think on a winner ranking, his game is pretty by the numbers and nothing too special, I think on this list, when we're comparing him to people who are pretty big targets in the game, I think he's a pretty massive outlier in the fact that he is the only winner on this list. And I feel like while his game wasn't the most dominant in the world, and while it wasn't the most impressive in the world, I think it's definitely leaps and bounds above a lot of the other people we already talked about. And I feel like the fact that he actually wins at the end is a major reason why I decided to go with him at the top spot. So it's for that reason that I did decide to go with him at number 1. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really help to with the channel. Now I'll be back with more videos like this soon, as we are in the off season waiting for Big Brother to start, so be on the lookout for that. I'm on Patreon and have YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.